So I'm going to put my neck on the line. We're going to do some predictions. We're going to rank the base case, the bull case, and probably the really bad case, which is the bear case. We're going to go through stuff like Bitcoin, altcoins, dominance, some wild predictions, and what do I think overall about the market versus the previous cycles. But let's keep it simple. Let's get into it. And just remember, not financial advice. And this is my overall opinion. So there's three obvious rules here. We've got a base case, which is most likely, roughly you could argue 60% odds. We have the bullish case, which needs catalysts, of course, which could be roughly a certain percentage point. And we have the bear case of a certain risk scenario that may not actually happen. And yeah, as I say, it is all my opinion. At the end of the day, it could be different elements of catalysts that could come about. But more importantly, some altcoins may run, some altcoins may not. Which brings me to this screen. Liquidity. We're going to talk about the obvious question, is liquidity coming? Now that question often gets asked quite a lot, certainly on my Patreon. There's a link below if you're interested. I do a Q&A session every single Wednesday, and often we get asked, is retail coming back? Is liquidity coming? Have we got too many altcoins? All that kind of stuff. And on the screen here, we have the stable currency coin market cap, which I know for some people is a bit wishy-washy. The dominance of that is 60% of USDT, which is the main one, the main driver. And the big question we have is, do we believe that this is going to allow more and more people to come back into the market? Now, for me, it's not just this. It's obviously a green, beautiful candle. It's maybe Bitcoin hitting certain levels, maybe Ethereum hitting certain levels, maybe Solana hitting certain levels, maybe certain catalysts in the market, certain things happening that could be allowing money to return. In the previous cycles, we've had that. We had the ICO boom in 2017. We had obviously the stimulus and Tesla buying and all these kind of stuff happening with the last cycle, and quantitative easing, obviously. So stuff like that's important. But for me, we have to look at one big driver. Where is the money? Right now, most of it's in Bitcoin, unfortunately for some people, but that may well rotate when people get bored of that or they want to make more money. When we see more and more things like this print out money, it could be very, very interesting. And when you pair it to institutional behavior, such as the ETF inflows, which some people like, some people don't, there's a lot of positivity here, but there's a lot of negative outflows right now, currently. But that could well just because of August. But ultimately, there's a big driving force here. This is one catalyst alone. Ideally, it may well flip back bullish pretty quickly, and it may well catch people out. And on the screen, this is the Federal Reserve balance sheet, so to speak, which, as you can imagine, doesn't look great, does it, at the minute? But if stable currencies run and we get more and more printed, which is fair enough, and if the ETF inflows are positive, we're probably going to get a bit of a green light. And that green light could lead to some positive price action, obviously. But the ultimate question is, and you all know it, are we going to get the liquidity rush that we have in every single Q4? I've got a feeling we're going to get a run. I've got a feeling that, in my personal viewpoint, that often you find that, September is a really bad month for equities anyways. But more often than not, you find that bullish Q4 is always good. Right now, currently, obviously, could be very, very interesting. But will we get an alt season like last cycle? Possibly not. So that is a first prediction. First prediction is, I don't think we are going to get everything going bananas. And I think for a lot of people, that's going to piss you off and you're probably going to exit the video right now. But there's a reason for that, because Bitcoin is strong. Bitcoin is very strong. And this is quite an easy one. You all know my target. If you watch my video, if you subscribe to my videos, in between this box here, roughly between 150 to 210K. That to me is the bullish case. If we're looking at the base case, we're probably going to fail maybe in and around that 150K mark and maybe just dribble off from that point, which still actually is a 10x from the lows, right? Which is important to note. The one thing I will say, the bearish case would be that is the all-time high there, realistically, and we do not go higher. I find that unlikely, but what if something happens? What if someone like Donald Trump says something really silly or something goes really wrong and that becomes the issue? What if we get 0 rate cuts in September and 0 rate cuts in October? Oh my God, imagine what's going to happen there. So there's certain situations around that we need to kind of pedal. But obviously, as you know, Bitcoin is the key here. And it is a very big key, because that bullish spike could happen and it could end very, very quickly. What are we going to see those ETF inflows? Are we going to see that surge of liquidity going into altcoins such as Ethereum, such as XRP, such as Solana? We don't know. We need to talk about that throughout this video. But as you can imagine, the bearish case is also staring us in the face. What if that is the top? I know it's a bit risky to say that, but it is what it is. $124,000 all-time high is still pretty good, considering where we were not too long ago. Let's talk about Ethereum, because Ethereum, in my viewpoint, is the keys to the kingdom for all the altcoins, realistically, right? And with the ETFs doing a massive kind of flow currently, right, which is nice to see. So if we're going to go from the cycle top to the cycle low from the previous, right, which, as you can imagine, is not too bad. We've broken this big level of structure here around $4,000, which will be a huge psychological level. And for me, the viewpoint is I believe there's a lot of YouTubers out there, and I don't know who follows who, but there's some absolutely gnarly ones out there which are ridiculous. We need to be careful getting too overexcited about Ethereum. Why? Because Ethereum went to the cycle lows of roughly around $887, right? There's genuinely people that think this is going to go to $50,000 a cycle, which I cannot compute in my fat head. I just can't. And I think that's the stupid case. Now, for me, the bullish case would be in and around this 7,000 to 11,000 kind of area. Now, a lot of my analysis goes up the Fibonacci extension levels, right? So just to give you a real life example here, if we're going to go from this cycle kind of top to the low of, where was it? There it is. You know, we can see certain situations roughly around there, give or take. We often hit certain extension levels, right? And we also get this thing called diminishing returns, right? So as you can see here, we pretty much nearly hit the 3.618, but we also rejected quite a few levels in and around this point as well at the past, right? You know, when I look at this in terms of the overall cycle, you know, some people will be genuinely looking at like some silly levels, but for me, the bullish case is over 7,000 in between that 10,000, 11,000 area. For me, that's kind of like psychological areas. If you're looking at Ethereum at $10,000, it's probably going to be a huge psychological level, realistically, right? So that for me would be a bullish case. In terms of the bearish case, would be obviously we don't create much of an all-time high and we kind of flop at around 6,000, which still is actually quite good. Yeah, and maybe the base case you could be arguing roughly around $7,000 or $8,000. That's kind of the obvious, but the catalyst could be very, very simple. Even if, as I say, right, and people are like, "Oh my god, that's not very good." You got to go from the lows. Yeah, some of these moves are still monstrous in terms of risk and in terms of traditional market values. And going back to the situation of a traditional market, they're still really good gains. But some people want more, and I know that. But ultimately, again, psychological element is the profit is in your entry. If you got a good entry, you're probably not that ass. But if you were buying Ethereum at like $4,000, you wanted to go to 8,000, 12,000, 16,000, 20,000 because you want them multiples, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, Ethereum doesn't need the mania. It doesn't. It just needs steady ETF, demand. It needs the BTC pair to rise up again. But realistically, we've got to look at the obvious here. Diminishing returns is all over these the Ethereum pairs. And that's just the top and bottom of it. We've seen it in the previous cycles where we go high and we don't drop as far. We don't go as high, we don't drop as far. Well, kind of we did, to be fair. But realistically, we may only go up to here. What if we only do like a 3x move on the BTC pair? That's going to give you a pretty shitty result. It's not going to hit those 50,000 kind of levels, which people are randomly expecting for some reason. But ultimately, it depends on what the price of Bitcoin is, obviously. But don't expect an all-time high in these BTC pairs. I don't think it's going to happen personally. I think it'll be very, very hard to do that. Before we get on altcoins, I think it's a good idea to talk about dominance because I think a good prediction here would be very nice. I've got two obvious levels, and you know this on my channel. Bullish case would be in and around the 45% levels, in and around this area here, give or take. You could probably argue I can make that a bit smaller, a bit lower there. In and around this zone here. Obviously, we've got an area where it could be quite nice. It could be a potential base case of like, well, we'll actually go down to here at least. But people may not be happy with that because obviously, I said before, there's a lot of wealth in Bitcoin currently. It's still sitting there chilling. But the reality is that this market is very, very different. We've gone up for longer. That's fine. The drops are nowhere near as heavy what we've had in the past. We've had less alt seasons as well, which is hugely important, by the way. So realistically, even if we're going on to here, we are going to get an alt season. It's just not going to be very big, which may upset people, or it may be more isolated to certain things, which is narrative based, which is what we've seen before in the past as well. Obviously, the mega bullish case would be down here. But again, we're still seeing the same situation where we're getting these diminished returns where the highs are nowhere near as high, the lows are nowhere near as low. We didn't go as high currently right now. What about if we don't go as low? It's a possibility, right? So we need to be mindful of that. And obviously, you've got to look at the total 3/BTC and how they run as well. Because for me, those haven't run yet. But realistically, the bearish case would be this drops roughly around here and goes even higher and doesn't come down. That would be horrible, especially going into Q4. But for me, the obvious base case would be we've got to go around to those 52, 55% levels at least to start seeing what's going to happen. Then obviously even lower. But I'm not very confident that we're going to see a hurtling drop very, very aggressively like this, because this is showcasing that liquidity has driven and moved and changed rapido. We haven't had that sign yet, which is kind of a bit worrying. And to kind of like back this up a little bit, we can talk about stable currency dominance. This is a lot slower in for drop and not ideal, but we need to get lower. These need to go down to these levels. This needs to go down to the 4% or even the 2% to get liquidity. As I said before, with the stable currency dominance, it needs to drop like fuck. It needs to drop fast. And then that one would allow the catalyst of everything to build and continue, because everything else doesn't look that great. And when you pair it with the likes of the total 3/BTC, we haven't broken out yet. It doesn't look that good. Doesn't look that sexy anyways. And that's kind of telling us that, well, actually, altcoins haven't ran yet. You've not missed the boat. And this is why we're doing a bit of a prediction video for a bit of shit and giggles. By the way, if you want to trade, or if you're interested in futures trading and you want to just ride the momentum and not get caught out by holding the spotty bags, check out Blowfin. There's a link below. You get 20% back on fees. It's open to UK members for futures trading. It may not be for long. And yeah, it's a good one. Check it out. So let's look at XRP. Now, I talked at length on TA about XRP on my Patreon video yesterday, that technical analysis. And I said it was overvalued, right? Because, ultimately, when you look at the likes of XRP, where it is right now, it's over its previous all-time high, kind of, it has made a new all-time. That's what I'm talking about. But realistically, it's in and around these areas, and we're going into a bull market and it's already here. You would have wanted it to be a bit lower, really, like my personal thoughts. Now, for me, I think a lot of people will be looking at this thinking, wow, this is going to go to like 10, 15, whatever dollars. But the big drawdown to all this is the fact that how high do we go on the BTC pair? If it breaks out and goes up and retests some levels, which it can, by the way, just going to kind of show you case, bear with me. There we go. We've consolidated for absolute yonks and we're at the top end area. Now, even 147% move and a retracement up towards these levels here would be quite good, but it's not going to give you that $10 to $15 XRP unless Bitcoin really goes to the moon. But yeah, I think that the base case for this would be roughly in and around the $5 to $6 mark, in my personal thoughts. I know the charts are a bit weird here, and it's kind of really is a punt, but I'm kind of guesstimating off the fact of we're going to go up and retest maybe these levels of around 7,000 sats. And if you don't know what the price formula is, basically, long story short, if Bitcoin stays the same, let me just showcase, rough sort of price, 147% would be roughly around here if Bitcoin stays the same. So this is why, $7 to $10 could be a good one, but ultimately, more importantly, it needs to do that on the BTC pair. The downside to this is obviously that is based off what Bitcoin's current price is. Problem is you're going to probably see Bitcoin do something different to what you expect, or we're not going to see any sort of BTC move on the BTC pair as aggressive as that, because it already has had a huge move. But catalyst breeds good news, breeds good regulation news. XRP could be the obvious one, and it could be the one that allows liquidity to get soaked up, because existing holders will come back and they'll go, oh, I like XRP. I bought it back in 2018. I lost money. I want to make some money on it. It's a typical kind of romantical story, isn't it? Where people will come back to their bags, and XRP will be the obvious one. But yeah, I think a lot of people will be looking at a bearish case of like probably now, as in like that's it, top. Base case, arguably looking at that $5 to $6. I think bullish case, you're looking into around that $9 to $10 mark, but it depends on so many factors. It depends genuinely on that BTC pair. Can we break up from this consolidation zone from 2019 levels and go and retest into this gap here? If we do that, it's going to look pretty good. Let's look at Solana. Now on the screen, I've already put in rough sort of areas around a rough sort of time frame of what the BTC pair is. which is roughly, again, similar sort of numbers as XRP actually. But ultimately, in terms of like going retest this area of where the previous all-time high is, roughly around 40, well, yeah, 40,000 sats, give or take, right? Which is a decent chunk, by the way. But the problem is that's only going to yield you a base case, bullish case of roughly around $500, give or take, right? But that's based, as I say before, on the current Bitcoin price. If obviously Bitcoin does well. Now, I know a lot of people that will think $1,000, $2,000 for Solana, and I can kind of see that. But you'd need to have a frenzy zone with the meme coins, and people need to be really going mental with it. And then that could always spark a bit of interest in the Solana, and how those gains returning from obviously meme coins into Solana would create that snowball effect. Kind of what we're seeing with Ethereum back in the day with the ICOs, right? Where people were putting money into ICOs and making 10x's overnight and then going into Ethereum. We need that to happen. Now, that's where it gets a very, very big grey area, because if that does happen and it goes mental, you're looking at $1,000 easy, aren't you? Let's be honest. We've got to be honest with that. And then I've often said on my Patreon about Solana, and a lot of people do ask me, what would I rather buy, Ethereum or Solana? What would do the best? For me, I look at Solana at 2.58% of the market, and I think, you know what? I can see it clawing some of those gains. I can see it going up to 5, 6, 7% of the market, right? Which will be a huge bullish statement in itself. But the downside is, what if that meme coin culture doesn't return because so many people have been wrecked? We don't know, right? It is easier to use. It is cheaper. It's more efficient with the Phantom wallet and all the other wallets around the ecosystem of Solana. But in terms of the base case for me, I think this area here around $500, right? If we're going into a bullish Q4, we're going to be looking at least that. As I said before, a bullish case will be roughly around $1,000 at least, especially with the mania phase and how people multiply their Solana. We've seen that before in the past. So it could be very, very interesting. But in terms of a bearish case, we've got to be looking at these kind of areas of all-time highs, roughly around 300, 360, give or take, will probably be pretty bearish for a top kind of area of a Q4. You know, realistically, we've got to look at that as a downward area where, you know, a rejection of this area could be quite hurtful, let's be honest. So yeah, Solana's an interesting one. Now, for all you Chainlink people, it's doing really well, but it needs to do better. It does. This is still, you got to think, right? It's 2025, it's $25. This was a monster in 2019, 2020. And it's nowhere near its all-time high. This really has to catch up. And, you know, just to kind of showcase, this is still incredibly low. And there's still a lot of areas where this can do well. So even from current live prices, if we're looking at some areas of where it can go towards, you know, 100%, or what about if it goes back all the way up to here, 225%, give or take, right? So if we're looking at that retracement and Bitcoin stays the same price, you are looking at a very big move, by the way. We're looking at like new all-time highs. We're looking at some new areas of like discovery up to around $80 at least, for at least a bullish case, right? That's kind of what we're looking at easily as a bullish case, because what we'd be doing here, we're looking at that retracement up to that level, not an all-time high in the BTC pair, obviously, but ultimately it's going to matter massively in the USD pair because that's going to be huge. That would be my bullish case, at least around $80. Not too bad, really. In terms of like an obvious base case, you've got to be going at least for that $50 kind of psychological level, double your money, and going for that previous all-time high. Bearish case would be if we just flop and fucking die basically from this area around $30, $32 at least. But ultimately, there's a lot of good things going on with Link at the minute. So we're very, very interested to see. But for me, you've got to be aiming for that $80 to $100 for a bull case at least. And another good one and an interesting one would be obviously Cardano. Now, it hasn't really done much, has it? It's kind of $85. It's like nowhere near its previous all-time high. It's a really good one to look at. And again, if you're looking at the like stable currency dominance and stuff like that, and obviously where money rotates, often money does go into Cardano. Now, again, if you're on mobile, it's fucking miles away from certain targets. But again, you can see like we've had previous pushes here, 154% in the last big move around the inauguration, and a 258% move potentially to the extension level here on the BTC pair. And obviously, yes, if you start putting this on the chart, 258% at current Bitcoin prices, if it remains at level, it's basically an all-time high retest, right? So that's obviously going to be a bullish case. You're going to be looking at that area, but it could go much further, obviously, if that does happen and if Bitcoin goes higher. The downside is to this liquidity, right? And we go back to it. Is there too many coins, and we talk about it quite a lot, that are not going to get the sunlight? Last cycle, Cardano did. Last cycle, Polkadot did. It hasn't had anything right now. You got new assets like Hedra Hashgraph, who has opened up. You've got Hype. You've obviously got Sui and other assets that are quite powerful versus the previous cycle. Even you could argue Solana now, who has had a full cycle with it. So it's going to be very interesting. Not to mention the last cycle XRP didn't move because of the regulation side of it, and obviously the law side and the courts and all that kind of bullshit. You've still got stuff what's doing well. Look at BNB, for example, right? BNB is at all-time high and could go towards that $1,000 mark. It's been holding station pretty well, and it could go even higher. There's so many things here, but realistically, we've got to look at the fact that what if we don't get the liquidity? There's only going to be so many things that are going to push, or they've already pushed. And it's quite bearish to say that, but ultimately, that liquidity is going to be important. The questions are, how high does Bitcoin have to be for people to notice? How high does Ethereum have to be for people to notice? And probably, how high does Solana and XRP have to be for people to genuinely notice as well? Or when we get that meme coin season for the Solana train to kind of go, or the circus to go more to the point. But you've also got to consider what sort of ecosystem's out. You've obviously got runes and ordinals with Bitcoin. You got the layer 2 or the DeFi world of Ethereum. You got the meme coins and the quick ability to trade those and to kind of get destroyed or make riches on Solana. You've got real world assets that could be becoming quite obvious. And not to mention deep in AI, whatever it may be, that could genuinely create a trend for a narrative. But those narratives may only just move. But yeah, in terms of like the obvious mindset here, and I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, this. You've got to take profit into some sort of momentum / strength, especially in crypto. You've got to scale in at confident points, and you've got to stop looking at what other people think. Now, these are just my base cases. These are just bullish and bearish based on the BTC pair. If you are hurtling into an asset and it's overvalued or no one's interested, you're going to have a very, very big problem. And that mindset of being able to kind of handle that is hugely important. This is a very different beast. And I get a lot of like kickback in the comments with my opinion about alt seasons and why we've not had many alt seasons, why it's different, and why it's harder to trade. Realistically, I'm doing that from a point of experience because it is different, right? It's just the reality of it, unfortunately. Now, if you picked your bets of Solana, BNB, Ethereum, and XRP with Bitcoin as your core holdings from 2022, you'd be all right now. But not everyone thought like that. Not everyone wanted to think like that. And myself included, I picked the wrong bet. I picked Bitcoin and I picked a couple of altcoins and they didn't do it nowhere near as I thought they would. The narratives weren't there. And the ones that did do well, I've sold them into Bitcoin and held that Bitcoin. The mindset is hugely important to understand that. So try not to get too caught out with it. But realistically, have your profit targets ready and go for it. And if you have genuinely any questions, comment. Also, if you want to know more, just jump in Patreon and ask some questions. There's 90% off the first month if you use the code below.